Hi, everybody. Welcome to Drag Racing's Golden Era. We're really glad you're here tonight. My name is Randy. I am the editor-in-chief here at Drag Racing's Golden Era. Tonight, we are joined by Bob Muravez, also known as Floyd Lippencott Jr., the man who drove the freight train, top gas dragster to so many different championships and wins, and just made that car a notorious car throughout history. As I said to Bob in the interview, in modern times, I'm not sure back in the 60s and up until the end of Top Gas if the freight train was considered as famous as it is today, but I can tell you that the freight train is probably the most famous top gas dragster of all time in our current era. So we're going to learn a lot of neat things about Bob. This is, again, a long interview, so tonight is part one of what's going to end up being a three-part series again, because Bob talked for, I think, almost 2.5 hours about his own history, about the different cars that he drove. He had some hilarious stories about, I don't know, Don Perdome wearing diapers as initiation to the Road Kings. He had some funny stuff to say about Connie Kalitta and racing him. And it's been an outstanding interview. And Bob Moravez really is part of that pioneering class of drag racers that, got their start in the late 50s and came up through driving various cars through all the way up into the very early 70s when Top Gas finally went away. But as we'll find out in later interviews, that wasn't the end for Bob when Top Gas went away. He did other things and continued on in his life and did some racing even later on in life here. So we're going to find out some really neat stuff about Bob. So it's my pleasure now to send it over to the interview we recorded about 3 weeks ago with Bob Moravez, a.k.a. Floyd Lippencott Jr. Thanks for being here. I hope you enjoy our interview. Hi, everybody. We're glad you're here tonight with us. And at this time, I'd like to welcome our really special guest, a pioneer in drag racing, Bob Moravez, aka Floyd Lippencott Jr. Hi, Bob. Welcome. We're glad you're here.
Hi, Randy. How's it going out there?
Well, we're cold in Wisconsin. It's 2 below zero, but we're surviving.
Oh, my God. Where's my long johns?
Well, Bob, with all these interviews, we start out with where it all started for you. And my understanding is it started with you by buying a 53 Corvette from Betty Grable. Is that true?
That's true. Yeah. It's just, we're out here in Southern California weather-wise. And I started working with my father in the washing machine business. It's a very mechanical end of it with this ring of machines. And finally, after working there and sweeping the floors and that since I was about 6 years old, he said, "You need to have a car. What would you like?" Well, it just so happened that the year before in 53 was the first Motorama out here in Pan Pacific Auditorium. And I saw that concept car, the 53 Corvette. And my dad was doing a lot of business with the trucks buying from a Sean Chevrolet in Hollywood. And so that summer of 54, he goes, well, called up the salesman he dealt with, and the guy said, "Yeah, I have this customers want to get rid of one." So we jumped in the car, picked him up, and went over to Beverly Hills. And Betty Grable was living and married at the time with Harry James, the famous trumpet player. And we went around the back, and here's these 5 Cadillacs, and at the end was this little 53 Corvette with an aftermarket hardtop on it that I had never seen on any Corvette then or since. And had about 1,500 miles on it. They never drove it. And I ended up buying. That was my first actual car that I went to high school in. I did have before a van, a small shop van, was a 49 Chevy sedan delivery that I started driving when I was 15. But anyway, so I had the 53 Corvette, and that ended up being my first race car. I took it to the drags. I got tickets in it, speeding, drag racing on the streets. It was crazy.
So I'm assuming racing your only transportation probably wasn't the most practical thing to do. Did you ever hurt that car?
I learned the hard way, like every young kid does. You don't race the car, you go out on dates and go to school in, type of thing. I mean, I had pictures of cheater slicks on it, moon discs on the car, blew the plower guide out of it, had to figure out how to put a stick shift in, which I did, type of thing. And then that taught me quickly not to do that, because that was a girl getter. That 53 Corvette, girls wanted to ride in the car. I was ready, willing, and able to let them ride in the car as me as their pilot. But when races and you got to pull the transmission out of it, and stuff, you have to hitchhike to school or whatever, or bum a ride. When it breaks, you find out who your friends are.
So we're talking about 1955. What were the drag strips that were around then to be able to take that to in 55?
Well, Lions drag strip was open in 55. San Fernando was there. Santa Ana was there since 52. You had the early San Gabriel drag strip, and you had Saugus was just closing up. So you had a lot of them to go to and that stuff. I primarily hung out at San Fernando, because San Fernando was just down Glen Oaks Boulevard, 20 minutes away, and that whole thing led to basically joining the Road Kings Car Club, which I got initiated in 57, I do believe, with Don Perdone. And we were a racing club, but it was a surreal time in life, especially in the early days, considering Wally and Barbara Parks was starting NHRA up to get the kids off the street. And it was all right here in Southern California within a 10-mile, 20-mile radius.
So the Road Kings, and in the future, not too long from now, we're going to be doing a feature on the Road Kings. It's an amazing car club. It's one of the most famous car clubs in the country, and is responsible for, I forget how many Hall of Fame drivers came out of that car club. Why don't you tell me a little bit about that? Who was in it at that time?
Well, it was growing fast. It was awesome. In fact, I had dinner with one of the original 10 members from 52, twin guys. And he ran into him, and we're having our 70th anniversary at the Lions Museum in April of this year. And I told him if he's got to be there. We're one of the 10 guys, but we'll get into that later. I've talked to Jimmy Miles, our famous historian from the Magic Coupe guys, and dates and places and all that later on. But me and Perdone were initiating that. And those are the pictures you want to have. I was in drag, and I don't mean drag racing. I mean in drag. They dressed me up in a dress, and Perdone was in diapers. And basically, one of the members, Tom Jant's father-in-law, had come home from the Second World War in Japan and brought home a rickshaw, a real Japanese rickshaw. And so they loaded me in it, and Perdone was my horsepower. He was there pulling me around in front of Bob's in diapers, and Ivo put a bar of soap around a rope around his neck. And Perdone didn't worry too much about it, because he didn't know anybody in the Toluca Lake Bobs. But so we loaded us up and out the Van Nuys Bob, and if anybody turned red, that was Don Perdone. But he goes into it too on the book he wrote about his life without drag racing. It was a great time. It was sort of like the old college hazing days type of deal, trying to embarrass people. We even had a couple of guys join up in the club that really liked their hair the way they were, a guy named Mike King. And so we put him in the back of a truck in Bob's and gave him a haircut to make him as bald as you are. But that car clubs and fraternities and all that, because a lot of what you now call hazing that you'd be put in jail to do.
Well, for those of you out there who've seen the movie Hollywood Nights, if you want to know a little bit of the hazing that used to go on, that movie's a great example of it. And they weren't exaggerating about what used to go on.
Oh, no, it's really something. There was one more thing on that. A lot of the fraternity brothers in my brother's fraternity at SC took a cup around and they spit in it. and then they blindfold the guy and then feed him egg whites. It had this so if you can imagine the mind games that they did back in those days, but it didn't hurt nobody. But today it would be called something else.
Well, but whatever. It was all done in good fun, I'm assuming.
Oh yeah, it was type of thing, just to see if you can take it and be part of the situation. It was a lot of fun, a lot of camaraderie, and we had club meetings every Sunday night after we all came out to the drag races at Rod Pittmiller's house. It was really a way to keep. And if if any club member ever saw you squirreling around the streets, doing things you shouldn't be doing with your cars, with your plaque on your car, then you would have a SWAT. And I've always had the money. And if you were, somebody said, yeah, you did that, then you, at the end of the club meeting, you basically bend over and grab your ankles, and I would take this thing that looked like not a bat or baseball bat, but kind of like a cricket bat.
Yeah.
And the money that you pay for would go into the club treasury, and he would grab your ankles, and he would give you a big. I mean, this car club, just to regress on that, we had 29 members with different kinds of cars. We even had a club car. We had a dragster that had a Chrysler motor in it with carburetors in it. And if your car broke, you could go out on a Sunday to a dragster with a club car. And that's the first ride Perdone ever had in a dragster, and that started his career.
Wow.
I have pictures of the car at San Fernando with him in the seat with Rod Pittmiller push starting.
That's awesome. That's a great story. I've never heard that before.
Yeah, it was, and it goes on from there with all the other stuff in this thing. But basically, my racing thing with the cars, that's where I got love for type of deal. And then the vet, that really did the whole thing. And then I really quickly realized I couldn't race my street car. And plus, I got so many tickets in that. Finally, in 1958, my dad took the car away from me. And later on, it was picked up, and it actually hit Bear Jackson about 23 years ago. Somebody restored it, and the serial number on that was number 3.
Wow.
It became the oldest Corvette, and it sold for $1 million.
Wow.
They knew about the Betty Grable. Then they had in the history of it, they knew from 54 to 58, there was no history. And then somebody picked it up from a used car lot in LA and then slowly but surely restored it. And since it was the oldest Corvette, that's what it got for it.
Wow. So obviously, you said you learned your lessons about your street car, which then translated into your first gas dragster. That's
right. Well, my dad and my family always were building boats. My dad was a fisherman and building boats. My brother was a skier. He's 2.5 years older than me. And we're building motors. I put a small block Chevrolet together for his boat, his ski boat. And in the meantime, in the Road Kings and that, I basically partnered up with a guy named Don Gady. He bought Rod Pittmiller's and Tom Jantz's dragster, and I built my first motor, a small block Chevrolet, about 300. It was actually a 283, which I bored and stroked out to 330 cubic inches. My brother had a boat that had a 371 supercharger on it that I took off the boat and went to Wyan, and he modified a 471 manifold to a 371. I ran the 50% overdrive on the supercharger because of the 371. But the unique thing was that when I went to Enderley Injectors, I had not known at the time, but found out later that Pete Jackson and Ken Enderley just became partners in Enderley Injectors. And Pete Jackson was the brother of a very famous ignition guy named Kong Jackson, very famous in early drag race days with ignition systems for guys at El Mirage. And so I walked in, I told him what I had. He said, come back in a week and he would do it. And sure enough, a week later, he presented me and I paid for him. Years later, I found out that he shared with me, I was their very first customer. In fact, he had the invoice number 1 on the invoice when he started his gear driving business. And had number 1 on this 371 end of the injector. And we ran really well, really well with that car at San Fernando, Lions drag strip, and the whole deal. And he would always take the first ride in the car at San Fernando. We'd go there. Well, one day he left his helmet at home, so he used my helmet. And I got a big head. I got a big fat head. In fact, over the years with Bell Helmet sponsorship and Bill Simpson sponsorship, they had to make a special helmet for me because of the size of my fat head. But that's okay. So and in those days, my helmet had a bubble shield on it with a visor at the top. Can you imagine driving the cars today with the bubble shield when the flame melts the plastic on your face? But we didn't know any better. We also had leather jackets, thinking we'd be thrown out of the car like a motorcycle driver. And you've heard stories, I'm sure, about fire hitting leather jackets and what it does to your body.
Yep.
But anyway, digress. So Don went down to San Fernando, and right at San Fernando, the car at that time was running about 140 miles an hour. And right before the lights, there's a slight little bump in the left-hand lane of San Fernando those days, where the helmet pivoted on his head to where the visor at the top that had the blackout on it dropped in front of his eyes, and he crashed the car on the left side of it, because there's about 1,000 feet past the finish line, just before you go under a bridge there's a slight dogleg right. Well, he missed that dogleg, hit a couple of hay bales. He didn't get hurt, but it destroyed the car. And that was the end of that race car in my association with Don Gady. Later on, just shortly after that, Ed Janke, who had the number 3 Fuller car, and I partnered up and went into the double B gas dragster in that Fuller car.
Okay.
So that was my dragster.
And that was still, at that point, you're still in a single engine gas dragster, right?
Yeah, single engine gas dragster. I remember that 371, one day we were racing Lions dragster at night, and I'm making the turnaround from the push start, going to the starting, and I'm cracking the motor, keeping the motor clean. And all of a sudden, I hit the throttle and the motor just stopped, and a little bit of water trickled out of number 3 hole, and that stuff. And what had happened was it broke a rod, and that was that motor. So I eventually put a new motor together with a 671 end injector, and became pretty dominant in double B gas dragster, to the point to where I was holding all the records, and we were going to Bakersfield. We're also going up to Half Moon Bay. We used to race the glass slipper up at Half Moon Bay, and that's again where my association with John Peters came up.
Okay.
We were racing in Fontana, and the following week I had a paid match race with the glass slipper up at Half Moon Bay, and I broke my motor at Fontana, broke the snout off the crankshaft. Turned out that John Peters was there. I knew of him because of the Quincy Automotive car with Bob Moravez driving it. Was the kick-ass car around. It held the records, and there were them and Lefty Mudersbach and Gene Adams with his driver were really the top 3 cars on the West Coast. And so he said, well, I'll lend you my motor out of the Quincy car. So I went down to Santa Monica, picked it up. He showed me how to work the Hilborn injectors. I went up to Half Moon Bay the following weekend, raced and beat the glass slipper 2 out of 3, and then basically came back. And when I gave the motor back to him, he asked me if I wanted to drive the car, and I jumped at it. And that was
is that before it was actually the freight train, though, right? This is just a double. Is it a double A? Is it a top gas dragster?
Oh yeah, top gas. The same car, the Springer front end, the same car. In fact, this coming March will be my 60th anniversary of winning Bakersfield on my birthday, my 24th birthday in 1962. March 10th, we won the big race up there, and Tom Perdone won, our club member, won top fuel with the Zuschel and Fuller car.
Okay, so with John Peters, and he's still partnership with Quincy, right? Yet at this point, when you first jumped in that, is that right?
Oh, it was Nye Frank and John Peters, and it was sponsored with Quincy Automotive.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Quincy Automotive was great. Bill Cox owned a speed shop, muffler shop in Santa Monica. He even sponsored Mike Sorokin, his coupe. He even sponsored Craig Breedlove, who later on, became, they were all connected in that whole deal. And Albertson Olds and Quincy Automotive in the Santa Monica were the major sponsors of race cars at that time from that area.
Okay.
And Bill Cox was a neat guy.
Okay, so I've seen different configurations of the freight train with I'm not sure what was in those things, if they were 392s or what were in there, but the original freight train had a pair of, what were they, Chevy small blocks?
Yes, 2 Chevy small blocks, 283 with a cleanup bore arm and that type of deal. Remember, we had plenty of power. In fact, some of the early ones, when Bobby Brissett was driving it, that type of thing, had one supercharger with a duct system on it, 2 unblown motors with a duct system. And if you didn't start that thing just right, I could watch that car at Lions making a turnaround, and the juice, all the fuel was going through the duct. So the last motor was the last one to start. And if you had a little bit of a problem at it, and Bobby kind of squeezed the throttle a little bit, it would blow the duct up in the air, the backfire. And then later on, the second configuration of that car with Brissett driving it was basically they had because we're all a bunch of poor guys, working at our jobs, paying our rent, living. And so the same with them. So they put a supercharger on the back motor, and then still had the crank-driven motor with the supercharger on the front for the front motor, because they didn't have the money to buy a manifold. So that's what everybody did. They improvised and made, especially these 2 guys. John Peters working at Engel Cams, and Nye Frank, who at that time was the Beverly Hills Fire Department guy, later went on to become the most incredible metal shaper and that type of deal, par excellence type of thing.
Well, and you bring up a good point, Bob, that some of our younger viewers out here may not even realize about the early days of drag racing. This really was a blue collar sport. You had a couple of guys that had jobs that tried to piece together cars and go out racing on the weekend. And it's not like the operations today where you got to have millions of dollars in the bank to pull this off. It was a bunch of blue collar guys.
Yeah, well, again, too, one thing that the younger kids won't realize, even the second and third generations, there were no speed shops back then. There were muffler shops that morphed into speed shops. Muffler shops, like my first sponsor, Accessories Limited, it was a muffler place that would put on loud pipes, and then pretty soon they started selling hubcaps, and then it led to manifolds, and that it was a place where somebody could go get his car to sound better, get a camshaft, whatever, go home, put it in themselves, type of thing. That's what you do. In fact, I used to do that with a friend of mine. There was a night manager of a gas station with small block Chevrolets. Guy would come into us, and then within 2 hours time, I was able to put a Dunpap camshaft in their car. And that's what we did. It was a fun kind of a deal. We all worked hard, and in fact, that's what I talked about. Today, you can go, if you have deep pockets, to any speed shop like Jags or Summit or those places, and you could, if you have a deep enough pocket, you even find guys in the back room who would put it all back together for you. But we already did it. We had to do it.
Well, and that again, another great point is that back then you weren't just the driver. You didn't just show up on Sunday afternoon in your street clothes and show up and drive a car. You had to be able to work on that car, or it wasn't going anywhere.
Right. It was just me and John, and maybe Nye. Nye was always there also too. He was an incredible metal man, truly incredible metal man.
So the freight train, and everybody knows the freight train. It is the most famous top gas dragster at least these days it is. It's the most famous top gas dragster. That thing was running, 180 miles an hour, 8.5. Is that about where you were running at that
Yeah,
point?
I was just thinking about that too, because 60 years ago when we went Bakersfield, I think we were running like 870s, 178, 79 miles an hour type of thing. John never liked me driving the car out the back door, as they used to call it. People don't realize that in the old days, the speed traps was 66 feet before and 66 feet past. So it's 132 feet for an actual try type of thing. So the race was won at the ET light. The only time I ran it out the back door was either to set a record at the track we were at, or there was money up for top speed.
Oh.
Speeds in the early days and that stuff weren't actually what they represented type of thing, because we had to run out the back door. And many a time I had to go down to the end of the drag. In fact, one of those stories with the Quincy car was we ran Santa Maria drag strip up on the way up to San Francisco area. And so I would go down to the end and that stuff to see what I had to deal with if I shut the car off. And there was this gentleman standing at a gate at the end of where these trees were and that stuff. They're about 1,400 feet past the finish line, which means the ET light. So John wanted the speed record. So I asked the guy when he was standing there what he was doing. And he said, well, when you fast guys come up the race, I open this gate up. And if anybody's having a problem, I stop the traffic. So you go. Now, it wasn't a major street. It was kind of like a back street in the farmland, whatever. It was just a 2-lane road with a very little change on the other side of it. No curbs, no nothing. So I go whipping on down there, and run it out the back door and got to shoot out. Those are the old chutes with the old ring slot chutes, like the D chutes, and then later on the Simpson chute was not where the cross form. He kind of brought the cross form, but I'm talking about the cargo chutes. And basically, as I come through the gate and that stuff, I feel this little tug on the car, and I stop across the street, right? So as I get out of the race car and that stuff, all of a sudden I turn back, and here's my parachute is picking up. It's getting up. And I realized that what had happened was, as I went past the gentleman, he stood in behind the car, and a parachute picked him up and carried him across the street. And I was worried that it hurt him and that stuff. And he was kind of getting up and coming out of the shrouds, because there's 40 shrouds on that early parachutes. And he's picking himself up, and I'm running over to him. I go, are you okay? Are you okay? So, oh, wow, man, that was really something. I'll never do that again, right? But those are the things in the early days of drag racing that drivers and car people had to do. You had to figure out what's going on and do the different situations and deal with it.
So you said 1962 was the year of the, what was it? What did they call that? The fuel and gas championships up at Bakersfield?
That was sort of like the Indianapolis. That was the one because there was NHRA had a fuel ban. They only ran top gas all around the nation and stuff, and only a few what they used to call some of the outlaw tracks, and some of your promoters and like Wally Parks and Jim Tice owning the organization, that they didn't want to deal with the danger of the explosions of the early top fuel nitro cars and hydrazine cars. So they had that. But Bakersfield Smokers, which was, you talk about another great Clark Club, that was years ahead of everybody else's, with Tony Waters and Ernie Hashem and Bernie Mather, all them guys with all their race cars type of thing. But they were older than us Road King guys, but they owned a drag strip, out there in the middle of nowhere. And that was you had that was something to tout about.
Here's sort of a general knowledge question for you, Bob, and I don't know if you can answer to this or not, but what created all those car clubs? I mean, we're coming out of World War II. Guys are coming home. They went in as teenagers. They don't even know how to live life yet because they went straight from high school to the military. Did that play a part in all these car clubs popping up all over the nation, or just guys wanting to belong to something? What caused that, do you think?
I personally feel that, remember, El Mirage was running before the Second World War out here in California and a couple of the dry lake areas around this country, not many of them that. So these mechanical guys type of thing, they all they knew each other there. They were racing in that stuff, and they had common interests. You didn't have all the speed equipment people. You had Offenhauser, who later made manifolds. You had Phil Wyan. You had Edelbrock with the midgets, and all these gentlemen all started their businesses on a shoestring and started building things. Jack Ingle was a B-25 pilot in England, and he comes home and starts doing his thing. So all these gentlemen, so what you had besides that, you had a bunch of these hot rodders type of deal. And they found that there was strength, I feel strength in numbers. They had a common idea. They liked talking. They meet in garages, and they started joining up and having car clubs, getting situations and that stuff. In the Road Kings, Robert's Rules of Order took place, so you knew how to control meetings and that, and how to set up bylaws, the type of thing. So everybody, not just business-wise, but just more professional.
That's amazing. I did not know that. Robert's Rules ran the car clubs, and I guess I never even thought about that before. I thought you guys were just a loose affiliation of guys who had neat cars and wanted to hang out together. That's actually impressive now that you say that.
Well, again, the Road Kings, and I've had many conversations in the early days and that with everybody. You had to have structure, and you had to have say, okay, we're going to have a car club. You just can't let everybody come in. We want to have a certain type of club. We didn't want a guy with a stock car. We wanted a hot rod. So you had to write rules of what was a hot rod. And by doing that, you basically had to use structure, Robert's Rules of Orders, having general meetings, having officers, presidents, vice presidents, people taking notes, type of thing. We had to have a banker, a guy who took care of the dues and that stuff. Everybody paid dues, had a bank account. In fact, the Road Kings at one time, we filed for and got a nonprofit status in the state of California, so that we could have, put on car shows, put on drag racing meets, type of thing, drag racing, that stuff.
I love these stories. That's great history. So let's continue on with you.
Sure.
So you've won the championship up at Bakersfield in '62. What happens after that? Do you continue to run the car, or did you step away from it at that point?
No. That's in fact, I'm thinking about that more and more as we approach March. That was actually the start. When my father found out that when I come home, I won this big meet, he put it to me about basically quitting and running the business. And he gave me three choices. He said, you go work somewhere else and keep racing, that's fine. By the way, I'd already been moved out of the house. My father and I had a situation where basically I moved right out of high school, and I rented a room above a garage for $8 a week. They had a bed, a hot plate, and a bathroom. And basically, that no problem. I still worked at the shop. And I didn't work. I went to work somewhere else, and that's where I worked with Don Gady's partner for about 9 months, and then back in the washing machine business. So that was a precursor of me getting into Quincy Automotive Car. And then basically, we won Bakersfield. I had been driving the car for about a year and a half, and about a year. And he gave me the choice. So I chose to take over the business and literally quit driving. But I didn't quit crewing on the car. So June was my official time away, and I've got paper clippings of that event in the local paper. Young champion race car driver, quits driving to take over family business type of thing. Yeah. First guy we put in the car was Craig Breedlove, because him and John Peters and Nye Frank were very close friends. In fact, Nye Frank and John Peters built his first car over there in Santa Monica, where he lived, behind his father's house. And he was so afraid of the car because it had a very unique handling situation. When you see the Springer front end on the front, it's what was classically called in sprint cars called bump steering. And you basically left the starting line, if you didn't turn the steering wheel a quarter of an inch as the front end came up, the car would make a hard right turn right off the starting line.
Oh.
And then at the other end, you basically at the other end, at speed at 180 miles an hour. If you didn't turn the car wheel back right as you went through, when the front end came down, you were in serious trouble. So he had a hard time getting that timing done. A lot of times you leave and you turn too far and the car will go left, and therefore you back all the throttle and then the car will go hard right. So it's all timing. He was afraid of getting hurt in the car and losing his sponsorship for his land speed car, so he stepped away. The next guy was a guy named Tom McEwen. Tom McEwen drove for Gene Adams, with Engle guy. John Peters worked at Engelcam, and he was part of the family. He was a driver, and he tried, and he didn't want to spend the time. And then Mickey Thompson got in the car, and he running Lions drag strip, and he didn't take the time. And the last guy was a guy named Bill Alexander, who used to drive for Ernie Alvarado, and he was driving later on with Jim Brissett in Top Fuel cars. And I'm trying to teach him. And all this time I'm going to Lions drag strip, trying to help them control and watch what they're doing and try and advise them. Well, one night at Lions, Bill said to me, he said, "You have no idea what you're talking about, because they've made so many changes in the car to fit me that you couldn't drive it." Put a dare out to me. And that was right around November of '62. So I got in the car using his stuff, and he hid in the push car, and we came down late at Lions. And if you've ever been to Lions drag strip, one of the things you asked me about to talk about later, in that time of the year, the fog would be coming in from San Pedro, and it was a very misty place and a lot of air, a lot of good air. Cars ran really well. So nobody knew I was in the car. I got in the car, did my thing on the starting line, let the clutch out nice and easy, and went through and went straight as an arrow, and literally set a new speed record, over 180 miles an hour in the car. So I was a smoker at that time, but I never carried matches with me because I was afraid if I had a fire, the matches in my pocket. But I carried cigarettes. So I pulled the chute out the other end, and I pulled my cigarettes out, and I used to light the cigarette off the glowing disc brake because they glowed. And sitting there smoking and putting the parachute in the seat, and I could hear this roar. The announcer saying something. Remember, I'm a half a mile away from the starting line at least. It's dead night, and the mist where the lights was kind of a surreal, kind of like just a surreal look at night with the fog starting to roll in, and they come down and everybody's quiet. Everybody's quiet. And I said, "Well, I can hear what was all the roar about in that?" And then they told me I just set a new speed record. The rest of the story was Bill got in the car to push back to the starting line and put the car in the trailer because everybody thought he had been the driver. And basically, years later at his 50th birthday party, him and I had a few drinks together, and he shared with me how he felt that night. He said, "I had to take all the accolades in something I didn't do." And he said it was just terrible for him psych-wise. Then I had to do something about getting back in the car because John and I were going to go home and cut the car up because nobody could drive it, but me and I couldn't drive. So I went around to all the publication people. Doris Herbert said she would keep my face out of the paper. I knew a lot of the photographers because I bought a lot of 8x10 black and white stuff, not only myself, but all my heroes in that time. And I still have that collection of 8x10 pictures from the old days of a lot of different people. And I told them, "Please don't take my picture." And they honored me, especially the people in the publications. Even later on, even NHRA gave me a license without a picture on it, a driver's license, Top Fuel license with Floyd Lippencott Jr.'s name on it, with no picture. You know.
Okay, so let's talk about that. You get back in the car. You're going to be driving the car. I
So
know that Steve Gibbs was involved in somehow in Floyd Lippencott Jr. that naming. How did that all come up? I want to know how that conversation went.
that's all 1963 history for me, because I got back in the car and our very first race back was the Winter Nationals. So John Peters was listed as a driver at the Winter Nationals. And every time I got in the car, I made sure I did my face mask and my helmet in the push car, making sure nobody had a camera on me. It wasn't like today, everybody's got a camera. It was only a few people had cameras, so you could pick them out because whatever, and got in the car. And basically we won that event. We had to race Connie Kalitta twice for that, but we won the race fair and square. We ran top speed, we ran low ET, we won AA gas dragster, and we won top gas eliminator, which was created at that event. Because before, it used to be A gas dragster guys would race each other and AA gas dragster guys would race each other. And then those two guys would come back and race for gas eliminator. Okay. Well, this time, because of the first practice race of top fuel, they made it a top gas at the end. Right. Bring back the 4 low ET guys. We put me and Jack Chrisman in Mickey's car and Connie Kalitta and Gordon Collette back in the program. Me and Jack were the two going to race, because I was AA winner and he was A winner. We were going to race. So they put the other two back in, and that was the type of deal. So that put us in the limelight. And then we basically, shortly after that, we raced at Lions Dragship, Jack Chrisman, who was the #1 top gas dragster on Doris Herbert's top gas eliminator list. And we beat him at Lions Dragship, becoming the #1 race, top gas car. First challenge out of the gate was a guy named Sneaky Pete Robinson. And he just won Indianapolis. And so he came out, and we had a very big race. We booked the race at Old San Gabriel, where Mel Reck, and then also that's just where Steve Gibbs started working there in the journalistic, because he graduated with at the Mount Sac college and writing stories and everything. So anyway, we pushed down to the starting line for that first match race, and that's where the name Lippincott was invented. Mel turned the microphone off, said, "We got to give this guy his own name," instead of the John Peters that I was using. And Steve said, Floyd Lippencott Jr., Floyd Lippencott, and Mel Reck added the Junior on the end of it, on the PR thing, and coming around. And that's how the name was born, literally. And then we won the race, still #1. And then later on, we always ran Fontana also. And in Fontana, you had Mickey Thompson running Fontana with his wife, Judy, racing, doing all the PR work and all the story writing. And Fontana was notorious for, down at the finish line, there was 3 large bumps. And out there in the desert, there's no air, so gas cars do a lot of detonating. And so the car would go into the one bump, load up, put a big black smoke of dent out, kind of free up, boom, boom, boom. And Judy made the comment that looks like a train pulling a grade, a freight train pulling a grade. And she's the one who come up with the name. So within a 3-month period of racing, you got me back in the train, win the Winter Nationals, and then have an assumed name, San Gabriel, Steve Gibbs. A month and a half, 2 months later, we're racing at Fontana, and Judy comes up with a name. And then John Peters and Beverly Peters at the time was very good friends with Judy. And we did the bib overalls, and John put a cow catcher on the front of the car. And every kid loves a train. So with this theme car and being a kick-ass car in racing and that stuff, that's how that whole thing happened in that kind of a 3.5-month period. If you need, I can give you exact dates, because I have all the.
I want to step backwards to something that you said that I didn't understand what you were talking about. You said at the Winter Nationals you had to race Connie Kalitta twice. What does that mean?
Well, basically, Connie Kalitta had just gotten a sponsorship with Chrysler Corporation. He was a pretty big guy in drag racing, especially back in the East where he was from. Pretty famous guy. All right. What a lot of other people didn't know too was that there used to be one red light rule. So if you went up to a car and you red lit, you had a chance to re-race that car. Okay. So here's the scenario. So we're getting ready. I beat Connie Kalitta and Gordon and Jack Crispin beat Gordon Collette for A-gas dragster. And so we were paired up at the push down roadway in the back and that stuff. And then NHRA announces they're going to bring back for top gas eliminator these two other cars. So I went to the squawk box and I asked them if, since me and Jack were ready to race, if we could race for this race to be a twofer for our first round, because there was 4 cars and they okayed that. So me and Jack raced, and Jack was driving Mickey Thompson's Hemi Pontiac that had won Indianapolis and that. And he basically, that was the closest race I ever had at the racetrack that day. And basically, he was right there. I looked over in the lights and I was maybe 2 wheels ahead of him, type of thing. So anyway, so that put us in a race. So they brought back Connie Kalitta and Gordon Collette. And these guys had already put their cars on the trailer and they already had not packed the parachute, et cetera, et cetera. So they're quickly unloading. And Connie Kalitta knew the rules. So him and Gordon Collette came up to the starting line, and Connie Kalitta, and remember too, there's no guardrails there at all at that time. So Kalitta red lights and pulls off into the pits. Gordon Collette and goes through, making a full pass. Later to find out that he's got to race again. So Kalitta's in the pits. He's got his car all cleaned up. He's got the parachute pad, got it all cooled off. And now they're really hammering on Gordon Collette. Well, Kalitta comes in and beats him. So now he's going to race me for the money. And then they're pushing it and the sun's going down. It's getting late in the day and there's no lights at the place, none whatsoever. So we've been waiting probably about an hour and 15 minutes, maybe an hour and 30 minutes for all this type of thing to happen. So we're sitting there and I'm getting ready and I get suited up in the car and sat in the car and I noticed Kalitta is kind of like just throwing his parachute in the pack and the motor's steaming and the whole deal. And I know he's going to do the same thing. I just got this feeling he's going to red light so I have another chance to clean his act up. So I got out of the car. I went over to the squawk box and I said to the tower, I said, if I red light this round, you'll never get enough light to run us off. What are we going to do about that? Come back, didn't say anything about come back tomorrow and that stuff. So they said, we'll get back to you in a minute. So I get back in the car and basically just before I go ready to push off, the announcer says, since there's losing daylight, there'll be no one red light. If you red light, you lose. When that happened, Kalitta jumps out of his car, repacks his parachute while a crew guy runs another 5 gallons of water through the motor. And that's when I knew I had him, type of thing. By the way, the very first time I raced Connie Kalitta was at the 62 Bakersfield race. He was my first round race. He walks over to me. You got to understand, later on, I find out that Kalitta's only 14 days older than me. He was born in March of 38, in February of 38, and I was born in March of 38. So anyways, he comes over to me at Bakersfield and he asked me where I would like him to put my name on his car, because his car was called the Bounty Hunter. Remember that?
Yes, I remember the pictures of the names on the side by the driver's cockpit.
We're sitting there in line, getting ready to race first round of top gas up there. And I asked him, I said, what is Ed Gartlett's, Don Gartlett's brother ran Top Gas, had a star asterisk behind it. I said, well, when I beat you again, I put an asterisk counting the times. So I thought for a minute, and I said, this is the God honest. I said, well, Mr. Kalitta, put my name on the bottom so when you crash trying to beat me, they'll know the reason why.
You ended up beating him anyway, didn't you?
Yes. Well, the funny part about it was from that point on in my career with Connie Kalitta, before he went to Top Fuel, I raced him 9 times. And every time I go to racing, including the Winter Nationals, I would look under the bottom of the car and says, Connie, you haven't put my name on your car yet. Maybe I say for my own personal gratification, I said I drove Connie Kalitta out of Top Gas because he couldn't beat me. But the reality, there was no money. There was no money in Top Gas. And that's another story about the Quincy car. If ever you see a picture of that car with 2 gas tanks in the front of it, because it was a short car. When I started driving, it was only 96-inch wheelbase. Yeah. We lengthened it to 106-inch wheelbase because we thought we needed a little more wider car. But Top Gas paid a $25 bond. Top Fuel paid a $500 bond. So we're talking about $17 compared to $350. Yeah. So we ran a lot of alcohol, and we raced a lot of people. In fact, the 2 weeks before the Pete Robinson race at San Gabriel, we won Top Fuel there with the alcohol car. Wow. And in fact, the comment in the newscast or the newspaper writing says, think about this. You went Peters and Frank won Top Fuel, and 2 weeks from now, we're going to be here racing for the #1 spot.
Wow. So did any special prep have to happen with those engines to be able to switch from gas to alcohol or not?
No, just a little jet change because alcohol made the car run a little cleaner. It was a lot easier to drive because there was no detonation factor. Another great story about having to fix something because you couldn't go to the store and buy something. Sometimes that car would break, the motor would break a rod at the races. Those 2 guys, Peters and Frank, they had a situation where, let's say you broke a rod in the front motor. Since the Ingle Cam at that time had a race, what they call rev limiters, to where your push rods would stay in even if you took the rocker arms off, they would take the spark plug out of whatever hole they broke the rod on. They'd push from the bottom from the panel. They'd push the piston up to the top with a broken rod head on the end of it, a piece of it, and they put a screw through the piston to keep that from falling down. They had a cowlet made, a little round piece like a rod, that they would bolt around the crankshaft so it wouldn't lose oil pressure and still swing. And then they take the rocker arms off and then take the magneto plug and pull it to the frame to ground it out. So now we run the car on 15 cylinders. It vibrated a little bit, but let me tell you, it was easier to drive because with the tire issue and that, 15 cylinders, it was a lot easier car to drive, sliding the clutch and grabbing the brake type of deal. We won a lot of races on 15 cylinders.
That's amazing.
That was a lot of guys did stuff like that they never talked about. But with Nye and John, these guys, they wanted to race, period. In fact, if the motors broke really bad when Brzett was driving it, they would actually put Brzett's fuel motor out of his Bonneville Roadster and run Top Fuel at Fontana, with his car, because it was just a matter of going to the races and having fun, all that kind of stuff, which doesn't happen.
And here's another thing, Bob, that again, the younger generation may not understand that. I know that there was a lot of spectators and a lot of fans surrounding drag racing, but drag racing was really a participation sport back then. It wasn't as much a fan-driven sport as it was about the drivers getting out and competing against each other.
Right. You're absolutely right. It was Cam Wars. It was Ingalls against Esky. It was Manifold Wars. It was, all the kind of, people have a hard time relating to that. The only way they can get to it now is they remember having gas wars type of, but that's all kind of going away. Everybody's getting more civilized, I guess, or whatever.
There was a lot of characters, and you mentioned Connie Kalitta. You talk about characters that were in drag racing at that time with some big temperaments, right? There was a lot of guys like that it was all about winning.
Right. show me a good loser and I'll show you a real loser.
That's a good point, Bob. So you guys win the Winter Nationals, and
Yep.
that wasn't it for you guys. You went on to win some more races that year. What were some of the other races you won going forward from here?
Well, basically, it took a little while because NHRA only had at that time 3 national events.
Yeah.
Okay. And then Nye Frank wanted to go top fuel racing. And so I stepped out of the car in 65. And that's when Goob Teller tried driving the car. Not tried, but did drive the car. And by that time, we also learned that you didn't need to have that front end Springer stuff moving. So there are some out there with a big strap around the front end of the car. So they didn't have to have that handling bump steer problem. Yeah. And then when John hooked up with Goob Teller, being a foot shorter than me, they literally end up, he couldn't see out of the cowl that well. So he drove that car for a while until John built a car for him to fit in. And that's the car that he also took on tour. But in the meantime, I went to drive with Nye Frank, and with Chad Herbert's sponsorship, we built a streamliner called the Pulsator.
Okay.
That was built in Nye. Chad Herbert did the injected fuel on motors on fuel, because Chad Herbert was also a very interesting man. He couldn't walk because of a medical issue. I don't know the reason why, but Leonard Harris didn't drive for him, but Lefty Muttersbach also had twin engine fuel cars, and Zane Schubert had twin engine fuel cars. And so he sponsored Nye Frank and me in the Pulsator car, and we built that car and started driving that car, type of thing.
Was that was that actually on fuel, or was that still during the fuel ban? Was that alcohol?
No, that was fuel ban kind of went away in 64.
Okay.
People don't realize that there was only a test race for 63, which Gaudlis won at the Winter National. There was no other NHRA fuel race that year, but they started out in 64 with a fuel and top gas. So that's how that all started. But in 65, Nye and I, started driving the Pulsator, and basically it became a really cool car to drive, especially under the canopy. And it opened a lot of doors up in top fuel. We had a lot of issues with the magnetos in the car. The car, as they started to pick up speed and get going, they started to have a lot of detonation problems in that, and figured out through help with Joe Hunt, magnetos, that it couldn't be solved with the technology of the day. So after that, I got in the car for the Sandoval brothers car. They were local guys with Madden doing the motor work, and Tony and Frank Sandoval were really two really nice guys, really super nice guys. They built this car that right past the bell housing, it kind of the frame kicked into where it ended up where the rear end was actually my feet. All the pedals were mounted on the rear end because the tires were kicked into where the two sides of the tires were only 10 inches apart. And so I sat in this little cubicle behind that with a bitchin' little windshield and all that stuff, and all the pedals, the gas pedal and all that stuff. So I was kind of like set back a little bit with these two tires 10 inches apart, right in my view, looking at it. And the car ran really well. It's just when we started running 200 in top fuel, but the car had a bad characteristic. And that was basically, as it started approaching 200 miles an hour at the finish line, I started getting little rubber specks on my goggles. So the car was starting to go 1-to-1, and the rubber started coming off, being hot. It would stick on my helmet and my goggles. And the farther I went past 200 miles an hour, that speckling got worse and worse. In fact, one night at the beach, I think we ran 218, 220 miles an hour. And I literally could not see out of my goggles. And you can't wipe hot molten rubber off your goggles. It would smear and make it worse. So, and it was nighttime. So when Tony and Frank and the crew came down to pick me up, I handed Tony my goggles, and he said, "How did you see?" I said, "I didn't. I used the Braille system." Yeah. They couldn't solve the car problem and stuff. And that was exactly the same time that Don Johnson basically asked me to drive his Beachcomber car, which originally was a Rod Stuckey car. Yep. And our first race we went to was McEwen was working with AHRA Winter Nationals at the old Vegas track. And we literally, we went there and we won the event.
Wow.
You know, we weren't supposed to, but we won the event. Ed Pink was doing the motor work and Don Johnson, the Beachcomber and that stuff. And so it was, so Stardust Hotels was sponsored the race. I've got great pictures of me sitting in the car with my mask on because I'm Floyd Lippencott Jr. at that time. And that was the crew members around me. Well, the money that he made off that deal is when we basically, he went to Roy Fiesta, who was another famous Road King chassis builder. He used to run a fuel coupe. Roy Fiesta, SPC Engineering or something. Forget the name of his company. But anyway, so they built a brand new car for Don and motor and that stuff. And we went to the Mickey Thompson 200-mile-an-hour meet in Long Beach and with a brand new car that never made a pass. There was 117 cars there.
Wow.
Oh, because anybody who ran top fuel on the planet was pre-entered, no qualifying. Wow. And how the ladder was formed that nobody knew about at the time because they would have made some changes was as you came in the gate, you were on the ladder. Some of these guys who were buddies come side by side and they were having to race each other first round. I understand the implication. Had they known that's the way the ladder was going to be made, they would have come in at different times, but nobody knew that, right? So literally we raced there and with Ed Pink doing the motor work, we won the event with 7 rounds of elimination.
Jeez.
And that car ran.
But I was just going to say, Bob, I wasn't old enough. I was born in 1967. I never had the thrill of seeing something like that, but 110 top fuel cars all in one place. That is, to me, that is just mind boggling.
Yeah, it was anybody and everybody. I mean, small block Chevrolet stuff, everybody, they came from everywhere and that stuff. Guys, there were 3 or 4 guys running a car. It was truly amazing, truly amazing stuff. And we were sitting there with a brand new car and literally, that was the only time in my life that I didn't pack my own parachute because I was very anal about my own parachute type of thing. And one of the crew members was a dear friend of mine named Johnny Seagraves, who went on to become one of my children's godfather and that later in my life. But basically what happened was that 3rd round of elimination, we got a bye because the person we were supposed to race couldn't make it. Another thing that happened back in those days was a lot of time they put the low ET loser from the round before in, but Mickey never did that. So we had lucky with the 3rd round, we had a bye. And just off the starting line, we cracked the cylinder wall about 100 feet off the starting line. So I kind of coasted through. Had I been racing somebody, my day would have been over. So basically, we come back to the pits and we're cooling the car down. But I also wrenched my back on that round and I could not get out of the race car with my back wrenched. So I sat in the car while they worked on the car, and my good friend Johnny Seagraves packed my parachute. And I told him if it failed, I'll never talk to him again because I probably would have crashed. But anyways, it was a good fun stuff. Everybody laughing at each other. But we ended up winning the race. 7 rounds later, race, and I'm sitting in the race car because I can't get out because of my back situation and that stuff. With all the accolades and whole deal. It was a surreal time of my life also. The biggest drag race in the history. They used to have 64 funny car shows and 32 cars, but never over 100 top fuel cars. 7 rounds of elimination.